All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to another episode of the Mike Lupica podcast. This is episode 97. If you haven't checked out episodes 96, parts 1 and 2, I had the good fortune to chat with retired NYPD homicide detective Phil Grimaldi, and what a career he had. 21 years in the NYPD. He talked about two wild shootouts he had in 1982 and 1986, and solving the murder of fellow detective Lewis Miller, who was gunned down the line of duty, investigating a robbery in 1987. Phil was a great guy. Had, like I said, a fascinating career in the NYPD, and so it was good to have him on the show. This episode's really cool because, as you know, as I often joke, with the Swiss Army Knife of podcast, we do it all: sports, news, fire service, and law enforcement. This next guest of mine has been my white whale, so to speak. I've been trying to get him on the show for years, and today he's finally here. My next guest has been a part of the sports media landscape in America for more than 40 years, having spent most of those years as a writer for the New York Daily News, as well as a contributor to Esquire magazine and ESPN, amongst other outlets. A best-selling novelist, he's currently serving as a columnist with both MLB.com and the Daily News. And in addition to hosting his own podcast previously, he currently co-hosts the Sports Reporters podcast with Mitch Albom and Bob Ryan, a podcast version of the long-running show that aired Sunday mornings on ESPN. Author, podcaster, writer, reporter, television personality, radio host, an occasional MSNBC contributor, Mike Lupica, finally joins us in the Mike Lupica podcast. Welcome, Mike. Good to have you.
Hey, Mike. How are you?
Good. Finally have you here. Looking forward to this. So glad that you're here. So you were born and raised born and raised in one spot, but raised partly between two spots. So Oneida, New York, and of course, New Hampshire. You moved to New Hampshire when you were 12. Just take me through what those early years were like.
Well, my dad comes from a family of 10. And so I have like 40 first cousins. So we all kind of grew up in that area. I had two aunts who lives next door. My grandfather lived at the other side of the property. He built houses in Oneida. And I, it was the ball field where I played with my pals was on the other side of our hedge. So it was like, I tell people I grew up in a Norman Rockwell painting. It was great. And then my dad worked for the Air Force. My dad was a bombardier in World War II and B-24 Liberators. And he was working for the Air Force when I was 12. And he got transferred to Oklahoma. And we were going to pack up and move from Oneida, New York to Oklahoma. And a week before we were supposed to move, he found out that he had been transferred to Hanscom Field in Massachusetts between Boston and Nashua instead. And so that was how close I came to moving out west. And yeah, we moved there. My mom and dad, they live in the same house that we moved into in 1964. And I first started writing for Bishop Girton High School, the school paper. I tell everybody, you can't go wrong writing for the school paper. You're writing for your friends. You better be good, And so I wrote for the school paper, and I started writing stories for the Nashua Telegraph for $5 a story, covering Bishop Girton High School sports. And the first story I passed it, I didn't even know I was supposed to double space. The editor sent it back. He said, we'd appreciate it if you could double space. But that was really the beginning of it for me, seeing my name in the paper. And then I went to Boston College, and they didn't have a journalism program. I almost went to Syracuse because they had a daily paper there, and that had great appeal for me. I would have been there at the exact same time as my pal Bob Costas, and we're the same age. And I ended up writing for 3 school papers, working nights at the Boston Globe, writing for the Boston Phoenix, and starting to write features for the Boston Globe, tooling around Boston in my Volkswagen Bug. And I'll just tell you really quickly, I ended up at the Globe in the most odd way. Somebody, and to this day, I don't know who it was, from BC, sent one of my columns from the Heights to Ernie Roberts, the sports editor of the Boston Globe. And I'm sitting, I was sitting in the sports information director's office at BC, and I got a call one day, and they said, it's Ernie Roberts on the phone for you. And I said, yeah, that's a good one. And I got on, and he said, this is Ernie Roberts. And I thought I was being pranked by one of my pals. And he said, we'd like you to write a feature for the Globe. And I said, okay, let me check my schedule. No, I didn't. I said, yeah, I could do it. And it was every year at BC, there was a baton twirler called the Golden Girl, and her name was Pam Lake. and I wrote a piece about Pam Lake for the Boston Globe. And the lead, Mike, was the following. She has the best pair of hands on the BC campus, but she doesn't play football. The next day, that piece was on the front page of the Boston Globe, and any choice that I felt that I had about my future was gone at that point, and I knew what I wanted to do.
And around this time too, we're talking with Mike Lupica here on the Mike Lupica podcast. You met Bob Ryan, and I had the good fortune to interview Bob Ryan a few weeks ago here on the show, and he was great guy.
He's your biggest fan, by the way. He said
really?
If I didn't do this, he was going to beat me. So here I am.
Oh, well, with that shout out to Bob. I appreciate that. But no, he around that time, you and him crossed paths, and Bob's career was really starting to ascend. He was covering the Celtics by this point, during an interesting point for them when they were transitioning from the Bill Russell years into winning 2 championships in the 70s. Like I said, interesting guy, great legacy. Tell me, about the early years and your friendship with him.
Well, he was a BC guy as well. And so he somehow became aware of me, and I wrote a piece about Satch Sanders for the Phoenix, and Bob saw it, and he would take me for a beer. I believe I was of a legal age, but if I wasn't, it was on him.
We'll say allegedly.
Yeah, sure. And so yeah, it began a friendship that has lasted to this day. He calls me little brother. I call him big brother. We're that close. Obviously, we sat next to each other on the sports reporters for all those years. And my first year in New York, after I graduated from BC, I was covering the Knicks for the old New York Post. This is before Murdoch brought the paper. And when the playoffs started that year, the Knicks were not in them. And my sports editor, Ike Ellis, said, you can go anywhere you want to cover the playoffs as long as you stay in the East. But we had the Buffalo Braves, we had the Cleveland Cavaliers, the Celtics were playing. So Ryan and I would pretty much in the early rounds go to a game a night. We'd go to a game in Washington. We'd go to a game in Cleveland or Buffalo or Boston. And there was a day, Bob tells the story better than I do. We get to the airport in Buffalo. We drop our bags on the curb, and the guy says, "Where to?" And we looked at each other, and neither one of us could remember what the next city was. We finally figured out we were flying to Washington. I had such a blast. He's the greatest pro basketball writer of all time. And I'm 23 years old, and I'm getting to do this. And it was as much fun as I've ever had in sports writing.
Absolutely. It kind of reminds me, Mike and the Mad Dog frequently would talk about the spring of '94 and how chaotic that was for them. And you covered that too, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But, just a glimpse of it in the 70s, when sports writing was really at its peak. It's an amazing thing. It's an amazing story. So 1977, you arrive at the New York Daily News after a stint at the Post, covering the Knicks. And the Daily News, at this time, you have Jimmy Breslin there. You have Pete Hamill there. There's a lot of great writers there. From different facets, crime, sports. It doesn't have to necessarily be one thing. You're walking in there, you're 25 years old. How daunting is that?
It was pretty daunting. I didn't know how daunting it was. Dick Young was a big columnist in town. He didn't like me, and he didn't like them bringing in a kid to write a column. I'll tell you 2 great stories. One is, it was so random how I got a column. Because after 1 year at the Post, I decided I wanted to write a column, and I went into the boss of the paper, Paul Sand, and he said, "I have a sports columnist. Get out of my office." So it was with love. And so Michael Burke was running the Knicks at that time, and I'd been covering the Knicks for the Post, and I got on very well with him. His best friend was Mike O'Neill, the editor of the Daily News. And O'Neill takes Mike Burke to lunch, and he describes what he's looking for to sort of balance out Young's increasingly sort of narrow view of the world. He's a great columnist, but he was becoming more and more to the right.
Yeah.
And Mike Burke, and I didn't find this out till years later. Mike Burke said, "I could give you a list of 10 people who fit the description of what you're looking for perfectly." And he said, "But there's this kid at the New York Post who's going to be better than all of them." And on his recommendation, I got a column at the New York Daily News. And one day I wrote quite early on. This will shock you. I wrote something that Mr. Young, who was the sports editor, didn't like. And he told me he couldn't get into what he called, just something, okay, with a member of his own staff. Some kind of contest. Michael, you can fill in the blanks. He wasn't going to get into it, okay? And I go down the hall and I tell Breslin this story. And Breslin grabs me by the arm, marches me through the city room, marches me through the office where Mike O'Neill's secretary was. And I'm thinking at the time, Breslin didn't care. Jesus could have been in there, and he was going in anyway. Okay.
Yeah.
He walks me in and he said, "Tell him what you just told me." And I tell Mike O'Neill this, and if there's a turning point in your career, this was it. Mike O'Neill said, "We did not have this conversation, but you write whatever the hell you want to for this newspaper." And it was liberating after that, because I wasn't like consciously trying to stake out a position opposite of Young's, but I was just going to write in my own voice what I thought. And all of the other older columnists in New York, Red Smith was so great to me. Red Smith to this day is one of my heroes. And he accepted me despite my age, because he told me one time, there's no age requirement that you have to pass to get a newspaper column in New York. And he kind of let people know that that's what he thought. And when you have Red Smith's hand on your shoulder, you're in a pretty good place.
Absolutely. I mean, for example, look at Deisha Dozart, who covers the Mets for the Daily News. She's very young and she does a great job, And
she's doing a great job. She's really nice.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Hopefully I can have her on this podcast soon. So I mentioned Breslin and Hamill, again, two legends. Breslin, I believe it was son of Sam that told Breslin that he was partly inspired to turn himself in because of, I guess, the conversation, the exchanges that they have had. You're right. Yeah. So, I mean, and Hamill, of course, and not enough good things can be said about Hamill. A great author to A Drinking Life, one of his best works. His books about New York City after 9/11 up there as well. Being in the shadow, well, not in the shadow, but being under the tutelage, there we go, that's what I'm looking for, of these two outstanding, just legends of the craft. Take me through just the personal moments with them and your favorite thing about each man.
They made me want to be a newspaper columnist. Even when I was in Boston, I'd go to Harvard Square and get the out-of-town newspapers and read Breslin and Hammond. And here was my thing. They both taught me that you could write a column and write books. And now here I am at the Daily News on the 7th floor of this iconic building, 220 East 42nd Street, between 2nd and 3rd, closer to the corner of 3rd. You've seen the Globe in the Superman movies. That was in our lobby. They shot that in our lobby.
Wow.
They're 100 feet down the hall. And I could just go down and talk to them whenever I wanted. I've described it. We did this tribute to Pete a few years ago, and I described it. Breslin was on one side, Hamill's on the other, and their assistant, Anne-Marie Caggiano, was in the middle, sort of like Switzerland, okay? And there was cigar smoke from Jimmy, there was cigarette smoke from Pete, and as I've described many times, and all this magic and genius in the air between them. It was such an amazing experience. I'm living on the Upper East Side. I could walk down 2nd Avenue to the office, and it was the other night at the Field of Dreams game. They quoted the movie, "Is this heaven?" Well, I used to ask myself that question all the time.
We're talking about Mike Lupica here in the Mike Today podcast. This is episode 97. We're closing in on the century mark, and we're happy to have Mike here. So you mentioned writing books as well. Your first novel was Dead Air, which was published in 1986. And the premise of the book was a character who's an investigative journalist by the name of Pete Finley has to follow the trail of clues behind the disappearance and apparent murder of his ex-girlfriend, who was a former Miss America, who's now a TV commentator, or was at least in the book. So we often see, you and I are big Law and Order fans. You love SVU. I love the original Law and Order because Jerry Orbach, who's not with us anymore, is just like my favorite. So you see that it's ripped from the headlines, that's their format. Was that your format with this book, or was it just the mental creativity?
I wanted to write, and she was a friend of mine, a book about a Phyllis George type character and what would happen if she disappeared. It wasn't any more complicated than that. I mean, it was, by the way, Orbach, I was thinking about him the other day. He used to send me one-liners for my Sunday column, Shooting from the Lip. And I would use them every single time. And one time, Mike, I'm walking. So we got to know each other a little bit. And I saw him as Julian Marsh in 42nd Street about 10 times. He's maybe the greatest leading man for musical comedy ever in this country. And then he goes and becomes Lenny Briscoe. So one day I was doing Good Morning America in those days. And I come out of the studio and I'm in walking across Lincoln Center. And all of a sudden I hear, hey, Mike. And I look over and I see Jerry sitting in a car. And I should make a right turn. I go walking across the street. I go, hey, Jerry. And the next thing I hear is cut. I walked into a scene from Law and Order and completely ruined a take. And we stood there and laughed for about it. He goes, I think you need to leave now. I said, yes, I do. Oh, no, he was the best. And no, I just wanted to write a mystery. It's ironic that I'm carrying on a couple of characters from my friend Robert B. Parker now, because he made me want to write mysteries. And that voice that I had in the Peter Finley books, it's quite natural to me as the voice of Sonny Randall and Jesse Stone now. And I just wanted to get some points on the board. My first book was Reggie Jackson's Autobiography. And then came Dead Air. And Dead Air later, I wrote it as a CBS television movie. Kevin Dobson played Peter Finley.
Reggie Jackson's Autobiography. No pressure there, just one of the great home run hitters ever, writing the biography of his life. So, we'll accelerate ahead because I don't want to keep you too long. I know you're a busy guy.
No.
So, you were also writing for Esquire magazine for a decade too, 87.
Yeah, I wrote the sports column there for about 10 years, Mike.
Yeah. So, with this, the New York Daily News has its structure. And they let you do what you want to do. I don't think they stifle you. At least I hope they weren't stifling you creatively. It didn't seem like it. But sometimes with these magazines, you see it's a little bit different. Maybe you can be a little bit more free with language that you may want to use in the column. Maybe you can include things that you wouldn't be able to include in a newspaper because there's like a time crunch, So in writing for a magazine, especially with the column like The Sporting Life, we know what the similarities were. What were the differences and how did they help you?
We would basically pick a subject. I wasn't just writing an opinion column. It was pretty much I'd spend a day with somebody or 2 days with somebody. And I was very lucky that my editor was a former Daily News sports writer named David Hershey. And while I was there, the editor of the magazine was Ed Kozner, who was one of the great newspaper editors and magazine editors of all time, and later became my boss at the New York Daily News and allowed me to start writing a political column in the front of the paper. So it was a different vibe, but it was the same, Mike, it's the same basic thing. I used to tell people that writing a column is the greatest training for writing a novel, because it's got to have a beginning, a middle, and an end. You have to grab the attention of the reader. You have to find how to best use dialogue. And so in those, I was writing little novels in 1,000 words or 900 words or whatever it was. And so I never felt like Esquire was less natural form for me than writing the column. I wrote one longer piece for them. I did a cover story on John McEnroe that actually led to me getting the column. And I had a really good time. I think I wrote more sports columns for Esquire than anybody. And it was, it was just another form of writing. When I was writing my kids' books, I go around to schools all the time and I tell kids, I'd appreciate it if you tell your mom and dad to buy Mr. Lupica's books, because I have no other skills. So if the writing thing goes south, I've got nothing to fall back on. And I said, please don't count television. If I can get my own show, so could you.
And so that brings us, ironically, it segues perfectly into my next question, because 1988 is when the Sports Reporters begins. And I when I talked with Bob, I asked him, because he loved writing columns. He had tried out television locally. He didn't like it very much, by his own admission. Yeah. So, going from writing a column to now being on television, it's a bit of a transition that, can stifle some, but others thrive off of it. So you have this show. Its original moderator was some fellow by the name of Gary Thorne. Who knows what became of him, right? and then, of course, followed was Dick Schaap and later John Saunders. But when the premise was first, when you were first approached about the show and the premise of it was suggested to you, what was your thoughts on it and what led you to accept it?
we shot a pilot, and I'm trying to remember, I can't remember what year it was. And in the original pilot, Terry O'Neill, who had been a big shot producer at NBC and CBS, had this idea for a show like this. And I think we had 4 panelists in the pilot. I think it was me, Dave Anderson, Will McDonough, and I think Stan Hochman for Philadelphia. My memory may be off, but that was the group, and we shot a pilot for this show. And then we used to shoot like on Tuesdays or Thursdays at Channel 5 in New York City. I remember the big thing for us was when we finally got into the TV Guide. This sounds like a generational thing, but when you could actually find when we were good, because we weren't on Sundays at the start, we were on all over the place. And then somebody else produced it, and then Joe Valerio, who was the guiding force behind the show, who passed away recently, he took it over, and he called me and he said, "I want you to come back and do the show." And I said, "If I'm going to do it, you got to get Ryan. Just sit me down next to Ryan. We'll be fine." Okay. And then of course it became Mitch, and then Bill Conlon and other people. And then, we ran for 28 years, and nothing runs for 28 years. I mean, we had prime real estate at ESPN on Sunday mornings for 28 years. And Mike, frankly, we're not sure why they took us off the air, other than maybe budget. The ratings hadn't dropped. We were fully sponsored, and it seemed like a boneheaded decision. But so now we put the band back together, and we're having a ball doing a podcast.
But you went out on top. You didn't go out sad. You went out on top in a sense, even though obviously it would have been nice to see it continue. That show I missed, not to age you, but I was born in 2000, so I didn't quite get the chance to benefit.
That's just so annoying. Here's the problem. Here's the problem with you talented young people. Okay. The guys who say they grew up with me keep getting older. Okay. And it was the state of the newspaper business. I tell people all the time, like, I did not plan on becoming a dinosaur quite this soon. And it's why I keep writing my column. It's fun. And 2000, that's great. You know what? This has been going so nicely. And then you smack me with the fact that you're 12 years old. Thank you very much.
I'm sorry. But, I didn't get the chance to benefit from the Dick Schaap era, because obviously he passed away.
Oh boy.
In 2001, and what an era it was. With YouTube, you can go back and watch the old show, so that's nice. But to actually see it in real time.
Right, hold on. Don't move. Hold on.
Oh, no problem. Talking about Mike Lupica here on the Mike Today podcast. This is episode 97.
See this very well, Michael?
Yes, for my audience that's not going to watch this on YouTube, that'll listen to it, what Mike is showing me right now is a picture, it's a great one, of him sitting next to Dick Schaap, I guess on the set of the Sports Reporters.
With me, for people, to give them the visual, my hair is much darker. It looks like my prom. And Schaap is looking at me the way he always looked at me, like, oh God, what's he going to say next? But let me tell you something. He is as talented a person as has ever been in print / television. And the thing he did, Mike, was he made me look better. I can't speak to all the other guys. He made me look better. He would turn to me and set me up and allow me to get off a good line. And I will tell you this, he was the smartest and the funniest one on the panel always. And I'd be driving home when we did the show in Times Square. I'd be driving home to Connecticut after the show was over. And I think of something that I wish I had said at a particular moment in the show. Schaap always said it. He was so present in that show. And when we lost him, we knew how sick he was. He'd gone in for a second hip surgery, and he never came out of the hospital. He went in right after September 11th. And he died a few days before Christmas, but we knew how bad it was. And so we knew when John Saunders sat down, that he was going to be around for a while. Nobody ever said, oh, John will be replacing Dick Schaap. But the analogy I've always used, Mike, is it was like To Sir with Love. This elegant, wonderful guy sat down with all the bad kids in class and he totally got the show. He told his wife Wanda after the first week, "Oh my God, I can't sit here with these three egos but he totally got it. And he became one of my best friends. And then, not too terribly long ago, we lost him too. So, yeah.
John, I was able to grow up watching, so I had the benefit of the John Saunders era. And for me, I told this to Bob when he was on, I'm Dominican, and you don't see a lot of Dominican hockey fans. I've been a New York Rangers fan for 15 years and a diehard one.
Oh, thing. No, that's too bad.
So, to see a guy like John, my friends jokingly call me an Oreo, to see a guy like John love hockey the way that he did, because let's face it, when you look at guys like us,
he
you think,
played. He was a player.
He was a player too, and on top of that, as I said to Bob, when you see guys that look like us, you think, okay, he's probably into basketball, he's probably into football and baseball. And I love those sports too, but you don't think about hockey. And so to see a guy like that, I'm like, oh, I'm not the only one that happens to look like this and love a sport like that.
Hey, I will tell you a great story about John's love of hockey. And he, there were always like physical things that were happening. He's diabetic, and so he had a lot of physical issues as his life went on. And he worked so hard, and he worked such hours. And he one night he's going home from ESPN, and it wasn't anything. He had a car accident, okay, and he survived it, but I think it was because he was so tired, okay. So he's in the hospital, and I call him the next morning when I know he's awake, and I hear him say, "My ribs are broken, so whatever you do, don't make me laugh." And I said, "No, of course not. I want it." And he goes, "No, I really mean it. Don't make me laugh." And I said, I'm not calling to make you laugh, but I just want to ask you one question." And he goes, No, don't, no questions. It was during the hockey strike. And I said, "Was this a bizarre suicide attempt on your part?" And he starts coughing and laughing, and he goes, "Thank you," and hung up on me.
Oh boy. John Saunders and Dick Schaap too, greatly missed. And for those of you that, like myself, I mentioned earlier, I didn't get the chance to benefit from Dick Schaap. Just type in Sports Reporters 90s, and I'm sure if you go on YouTube, it'll pop up and you'll see everything that Dick was able to bring to the show, and then some. And John too.
John. You know what, Mike, they kind of built ESPN Classic back in the day around Dick. I'll tell you this, and then we'll move off Dick Schaap. But mm-hmm. I always thought when they did that big oral history of ESPN, Dick Schaap didn't get nearly enough love, because his presence on that network from the first time he showed up lent such street cred to anything he touched at ESPN. And he was a major player as that thing was taken off. And didn't, to this day, I don't think he gets enough credit. Fortunately, his kid, who's one of the most talented people there, Jeremy, who's like one of the Lupica boys, has carried on it so splendidly his father's legacy.
ESPN for me, and any sports network, I mean, listen, they have the debate shows and to each their own. That's just really not my thing. I think ESPN is at its best when it's doing those E60 type pieces, those investigative type pieces, or those profiles of athletes. That when they do that and they pull out, on occasion, because I feel like the network kind of lost its way, that's when they show me, okay, you still have your fastball. And that's television, especially with sports, at its best.
Yeah, they've got I feel bad because I couldn't find time to sit for the guy. They've got a doc coming up on the 86 Mets.
Yes.
It is going to be premiering out on Eastern Long Island, that I'm going to host on September 10th at the Southampton, New York Documentary Festival. I'm probably bollocksing the name, but I haven't seen it, and I was around that team almost every day, so I can't wait. I'm sure it'll be great. Nick Davis, I think, is the producer.
That team, that was a time before Joe Torre's Yankees, and when the Yankees the Yankees had some good teams in the 80s. There just wasn't a wild card, so they often went home. If you didn't win your division, you went home. And then
are you a Yankee fan?
Yeah, you could tell. Okay. It's an Aaron Judge jersey. They're playing better.
I just wrote a column about him.
Yes, I saw it. I liked it. I gave it a like, and of course I enjoyed it, and as he goes, so do the Yankees. So speaking of the 90s, that was a great decade for New York sports because every team had a moment. The Mets had a moment. They had their own star in Mike Piazza. Obviously the Yankees with Joe Torre. The Knicks were appointment television and were a playoff presence every night. The Rangers with Messier and the Cup run in '94, and they even had Wayne Gretzky for a time. The Jets even had a run. The Giants went to Super Bowl, got blown out, but they won in 1990 against Buffalo. Just so many different moments, so many different legendary athletes. Take me through that decade, and there's one specific thing I want to ask you about.
Okay,
it's just the decade as a whole.
Mike, I will tell you this, and people don't believe this now because of how great Torrey's Yankees were, okay? The Knicks were the hottest ticket in town. The Knicks, in those years, even though they did not win a title, they made the finals twice. They had those epic games against Michael Jordan. And I wrote this at the time, and when I evoked that time, I still say the same thing. As great as Torrey's Yankees were, the baseball season symbolically did not begin in New York till the Knicks played their last game. That there was nothing more exciting in those years than to get into a taxi cab and say, take me to the Garden. And, the seating was a little different. If you look back on those years, I was at the end of the press table, right next to either Pat Riley or Jeff Van Gundy. And it is impossible to describe what fun it was. And Mike, I tell people this all the time. I know the glory years for the Knicks were the two title teams. That was one of the most famous American sports teams of all time. Clyde and DeBusschere and Earl and Willis, all that stuff. Great Dave DeBusschere. Okay. But we didn't know how good we had it in the 90s. Whether they wanted to, you cannot measure sports and its memories and its magic simply by titles. You cannot. You can't. You ask old Brooklyn Dodgers fans, did they want to win more? They wanted to win more. But would they trade in those days at Ebbets Field? No, they would not. We did not know how great that time was in New York sports. And then, of course, you've already mentioned it. We get the spring and summer of 1994, where literally there was a big game every night for either the Rangers or the Knicks. I remember a Saturday, Sunday, Mike, where I had to fly from New York to Vancouver for Game 6, because that might be the night that the Rangers won the title, which they did not. I was in Vancouver about 6 hours that day. I go back to the airport. I fly through Toronto. I take the red eye back because the Knicks were playing the Rockets that afternoon at Madison Square Garden. I think it was Game 5. But that was it. I mean, you look back now, and the only thing that would have made it better is if the Knicks had been able to win either Game 6 or Game 7 at the Summit in Houston.
I had Mike Richter on the show back in May, of course, a legendary goaltender for the Rangers. And I asked him directly about that spring. And he said, the best thing about it was the Knicks were pulling for us and we were pulling for them.
Oh, yeah.
And that was the best part about it.
And Mike, sometimes if one of the team's games ended and the other team was still playing, they put the end of the game up on the big screen over Madison Square Garden.
Yeah. There's one of the coolest things I've ever seen. He's not with us anymore. Sadly, he died as a result of health issues a number of years ago. But Anthony Mason, there was a part where I think it's Game 2 or Game 7, one of the two. I think it's Game 7. You see Anthony Mason walking in a Rangers jersey, and the crowd just goes nuts. When he's walking into the Garden. The Knicks were still playing the Rockets, and it's Game 7. Of course, the Rangers closed it out. So the other thing I wanted to ask you about, because this is a really cool moment and very arguably the moment in New York sports in the last 30 years, 2000 World Series. I asked Ken Davidoff about it from the Post when he was on the show, and I wanted to get your vantage points. First Subway Series in 44 years. You have the Yankees and the Mets. There had been tension throughout the summer when Clemens beamed Piazza in July. Yeah. And now you come into this series of the Mets, who had gone through Barry Bonds' Giants, had beaten the Cardinals, and now they're playing the Yankees, who, listen, the Yankees, people forget, they knew how to win. Yeah, they were experienced, but that Yankee team in 2000 was really, they struggled down the stretch. And
I think they lost 16 out of 19 at one point.
It was 15 out of 18. 15 out of 18.
Okay.
And they barely won the division over Boston, I think by only 2 or 3 games. They pull in limping to the playoffs. They get through a really good Oakland team, get through another really good Seattle team, and the stage is set. That Subway Series, from the moment Andy Pettitte dealt a ball to Timo Perez, right up until Mike Piazza gave a scare to Yankee fans everywhere, but Bernie Williams caught it. Just take me through covering that series.
Well, we didn't know it at the time, but the whole thing turned on a single at bat in game 1. And it's Paul O'Neill against Armando Benitez in the 9th inning. And I did a column I think it was last year with O'Neill about that at bat. And I forget, you could catch whether 11 pitches or 12 pitches, whatever, 10 pitches. Okay. And O'Neill said, what Benitez didn't realize was I had no chance of catching up to his fastball. So he's just fouling pitches off. He's trying to figure out a way to get on base. And then, of course, he does get on base and they win the game. And then fast forward to, game 5 over at Shea. And I believe, who was it? Soto, who hit a million bouncer up the middle.
Off of Val Leiter.
Yeah, 47 bounces up the middle and to knock in the winning run. And then, of course, Piazza, he didn't get all of it, but when he hit it, it looked like he got all of it. And no, it was funny. It was a diminished Yankee team, and little Mike, I don't mean to bring up painful memories for you. Little did we know that when that last out did disappear into Bernie Williams' glove that night, that in the next 21 years, the Yankees would win 1 World Series.
Why are you doing this to me? I thought we were friends.
Because you told me you were born that year. That's why.
Well, you're getting revenge. Now we're even.
No, but nobody knew. And then on top of that comes what I believe is the majesty of the 2001 World Series, because as we move up on the 20th anniversary of 9/11, anybody who was of an age at that time will never forget those 3 games in the middle at Yankee Stadium. They just won't, Mike. And it's Joe Torre and I were at a party after the season, and obviously we know what happened in games 6 and 7. And he said, an odd thing keeps happening to me. People keep coming up to me and trying to console me because we lost. And Joe would say to these people, do you remember what those games were like, 3, 4, and 5? Do you remember what those endings did to help lift the city? He said, you tell me what we just lost. He said, whatever happened when we got back to Phoenix, we had won something, because it was an extraordinary time to write, because I was going down to ground zero and writing columns and then going to baseball games. And there was the New York of downtown. But people knew that for 3.5 hours, for those 3 nights, the world was going to feel a little bit like it used to on September 10th and 9th and 8th. And I can't tell you, when Tino hit one and Brocious hit one, and then Jeter becomes Mr. November, oh my God, those 2 Octobers and into November was an extraordinary time to be able to cover baseball in New York.
I interview a lot of retired members of the NYPD and the FDNY on the show, and all of them responded and lost dear friends that responded heroically and saved a bunch of lives, ultimately at the cost of their own. And the thing that you understand about it, myself not really remembering the event, but obviously learning of it through the years, is just what they went through that day and the losses that they suffered. That just to be able to decompress and forget about it if they were sports fans, and even if they weren't sports fans for a few hours, definitely had to have meant something. And shout out to all the people that have been on this show before from both departments. I thank you first and foremost for doing what you did that day and the days afterwards. And,
Mike, game 6, I was not, when Pettitte got blown out in game 6, I was not in Phoenix. I flew out. I was at game 7 the next night. Game 6, I sat in a car with some first responders and cops and listened to the game with them on the radio, and wrote a column about the Yankees from all the way across the country trying to lift their spirits one more time.
It was a fascinating time, and it's hard to believe it's going to be 20 years. But and I think that for my generation, I often say, for those of you listening that are my age, just try to understand, try to be empathetic, because maybe we didn't live it, maybe we were too young to live it, but what everyone went through, first responder or not, during that time, I don't think this generation will ever fully understand just the shock of that day and the magnitude of that day. And we're still feeling the aftershocks of it almost 2 decades later. So
yeah, I couldn't find. I was up. We lived in Connecticut, and I remember calling Pete Hamill because I knew he lived not too terribly far from where the planes had hit the building, and obviously I couldn't get a hold of him. And then he wrote and told me later that he was with his wife Fukiko Aoki, who's a brilliant Japanese writer, and they got separated and finally found each other later in the day. It was quite, if you could find that piece of writing from Pete about what that day was like. And then it was Pete who had one of the greatest descriptions of New York City I have ever read or heard. And he talked about how the true majesty of New York wasn't necessarily on September 11th. He said it was on September 12th and 13th and 14th. And the image he always used was of a great gallant fighter getting to one knee and then slowly gathering himself and lifting himself all the way up.
Before we get off on that, on 9/11, the greatest tale of heroism I've personally heard is, I have a mini series within this podcast in which I focus on retired members of the NYPD's bomb squad. And my good friend Donald Sadawi, who solved the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, he worked with a detective by the name of Claude Richards, or as they called him, Danny. And a few days later, Dan was sadly among the 23 cops to die that day. And a few days later, his colleagues went into his apartment in Greenwich Village just to secure his belongings and give them to his family. And the man before he left his apartment, he was off duty when he responded, put his detective shield on top of his last will and testament, and still walked out that door, knowing he might not come home. And he never did come home. But he went out that door anyway. And there's a lot of people walking around right now directly because of what Danny Richards did. And that, every time I tell that story, Mike, I'm getting it right now. I get goosebumps. I get chills down my spine.
Great story.
The man knew that he might not come home, but went anyway. And that's, if you don't know who Claude Richards is, if you're listening for the first time, look him up or go watch my previous conversations with the guys who work with him. Great man, great hero. So, I want to accelerate ahead because one of your novels that really people know best is Travel Team. And just to move on to a happier subject, and that novel, I've heard you talk about it before on your podcast, the Mike Lupica podcast. But just for the listeners that don't know the premise, tell me what that book was about.
All right, I'll try to spitball this so this doesn't turn into a documentary. Okay, when my middle son was 12, he was a very good athlete, but he and another friend of his got cut from the town's travel basketball team for being too small. Nobody said that was why, but he told me that halfway through the tryouts, one of the dads said, "We need to get bigger this year." And when Alex told me that, I said, "Why? So we can match up better with the San Antonio Spurs?" Okay, so the way they did it in our town was you filled out a form when you tried out in the team. You'll see how personal this is. What a personal touch. And if you didn't make the team, they'd send you a notice in the mail. So one of the other dads had given me a heads up, and here's this letter sitting on the kitchen table, waiting for him to get off the bus that day. And it's going to be the first time that sports breaks his heart. And he comes home and he's devastated. He's made this team before. All his buddies are going to be on it. Now he's got no season. So a couple of days later, I'm talking to Jeff Van Gundy, who's a friend of mine, and I tell him what's happened. And Van Gundy says something to me that changes my life as an author. In fact, one of my kids' books, I went to Houston and went to Jeff's daughter's school and told the story. Okay. He said, if this were the movies, you'd take all the kids who got cut, you'd start a team of your own, and you'd play the other team in town in the big game. And I said, well, I don't have anything against the other kids. They didn't do anything right. I just didn't think at 12, you ought to get fired. But as I've told kids ever since, Mike, the problem with a good idea in your life is once it gets inside your head, it's impossible to get it out. So 2 days after that, I became the owner, general manager of a rogue 12-year-old boys travel basketball team. I took all the kids who got cut. I started a team of my own. I managed to cobble together a schedule. Another friend of mine, Jerry Hardnick, got us gym time. And now these kids are going to have a season that they weren't going to have. And it seemed like a great idea until we started the season. And I had neglected to ask the other coaches how good their teams were. So early in the season, Mike, we're going into Norwalk, and my kids can't get the ball past half court. In my memory, it's always 35-3 against us at halftime. I finally went to the coach, Keith Wright, and I said, we have to call this off. This is like a science experiment that's gone horribly and tragically wrong. I said, these kids feel worse now than when they got caught. He said, no, they're getting better. I said, no, they're not getting better. I said, there's 2 boys on the team. I'm not even sure if they're right-handed anymore. To make a long, wonderful story short, they got good. They started winning games. They started beating teams that had beaten them. It becomes one of the great experiences of my life. They win their last game by 1 point, 3 seconds left. They run around the gym. I've got my Hollywood ending. I'm talking to my agent. She says, write a book. I write a book about a kid named Danny Walker who gets cut for being too small. And within 10 days, it's #1 on the New York Times. It changed my life. Then came Heat. And Heat, if everything stays online, we're supposed to start shooting as a movie, a Netflix movie in the Bronx next summer.
Wow. Okay. The first book I ever read from you, and without fanboying, you inspired me to start writing because just to tell a quick funny story, and I wanted to make sure I didn't forget this while you were sitting here. We're talking with Mike Lupica here in the Mike Lupica podcast. It's been a great episode so far. Having a lot of fun. I live in New Haven, lifelong New Haven resident, and
Pepe, you get Pepe Pizza?
Yes.
Okay.
Went there recently a few weeks ago with some friends of mine from the city. I had to enlighten them.
The best pizza on the planet. It's the best.
Yes, pizza. Thank you. Somebody, you see, he gets it. Mike Lupica gets it, folks. For all my friends in New York, there you go. There you go. But living in New Haven, my dear great-grandparents, my great-grandmother, who I was blessed to have 11 years with, not many people could say that, I would spend every Saturday with her, and I loved it. But the one thing that my abuelita would do that would drive me up a wall, and this was the only thing because everything else about her was perfect, is that when we would go to the store, she would take 2 hours to buy 5 things. Because she would stop and talk to everyone that she knew because everyone knew her. And how could you not love her? She was the best. And so me as a 7-year-old, you can imagine the kind of torture that is. So, I would say, Abuela, can I just go do something else? I mean, I obviously she had to keep me in sight. So she said, just make sure you stay where I can see you. That's fine. So I would go to the front of the checkout line where everybody was. It was a very public area and she could see me just fine. And there would be, the New Haven Register. There would also be the Boston Globe, the New York Post, and the New York Daily News. And that's how I started reading you. While I waited for my grandmother to finish these grocery trips that would feel like they would never end, that's how I started reading you. And not too long after that, in 3rd grade, the first book I ever read from you was 2 Minute Drill. To this day, one of my favorite books that I've read, even now at 21.
I think it's on this shelf somewhere, Mike. I can't see it. It's somewhere on that shelf.
Love that book. So, I wanted to ask you, I've also grown up lifelong WFAN listener. And I love Don Imus. I even listened to him on WABC, and he's not with us anymore. Sadly, passed away at the end of 2019. Really one of the great legacies in radio. He was rough around the edges. He wasn't for everyone. And you know that, but you were his friend for years. You were a regular contributor to the show. Tell me more about the I-Man.
No, he was, I always just tell people, Mike, he was exactly as you thought he was, but and listen, there was a period where he was beating the crap out of me too. But we had made peace long before. He was in my wedding. He was one of the groomsmen at my wedding. And no, I believe he's the greatest radio personality of all time.
I do too.
He changed the landscape. He set a template for everybody to come. And the thing that I always felt was amazing about him, 5 days a week, 4 hours, they're doing live, the Saturday Night Live is awesome, but then it's a written show, even though they do it live. Mm-hmm. He's flying by the seat of his pants all those years. And nobody would ever, I wrote about him when he died. He was my friend. I didn't try to justify the things that he said. He made big swings and misses, and he hurt people, and he knew it. But I was glad that he got one more go round at WABC, because I felt like he reminded people on his way out the door just how great, how truly great he'd been.
I'm trying to get his old sidekick, Charles McCord, on this show. I've spoken to Charles.
He's hard to find. Charles is hard to find.
I've spoken with him, though. I've been able to, but yeah, he's an elusive guy. So hopefully I can get him on this show. And
Mike Breen stays in touch with him.
Yeah, no, FAN, for those years, you can go back and find those clips on YouTube. I mean, it was such perfect comedy, because he could talk to Bill Clinton, the president of the United States, and he could be doing something lowbrow the next minute. That was the beauty of it. And Bernard was great. Bernard, a lot of the things Bernard said and did probably wouldn't fly today. But, it was definitely great for his time. And all I have to say, for those of you that might want to look up some old Imus clips, just type in Cardinal O'Connor Imus, and you will spend the next hours laughing your butt off. I guarantee you. So speeding ahead, and it's been a great podcast. You've gotten into podcasting yourself recently. You're not doing the Mike Lupica podcast anymore, right? You're off of that, or is it just in hiatus?
No, I'm with my book writing schedule, Mike. I'm pushing it by writing 3 columns a week and doing 2 podcasts as it is. So I have enough to do. I love doing my individual podcast because I interview great people. But again, we put the band back together with the sports reporters, and Bob and Mitch and I are having an awful lot of fun doing it twice a week now instead of once. And we are about to pass with Compass. We've gone past 400 podcasts. So yeah, we're going to keep doing it.
One of your regular listeners, when I'm going around the house, no problem. When I'm going around the house doing my task, or when I'm eating dinner on the patio outside, you guys are in my headphones, and I'm listening to you guys, and I love it. I really do love it. And I'm glad that it is continuing in podcasting form, because I was going to say, podcasting, I mean, listen, I have a show. So if anybody could pick up podcasting, I mean, listen, if somebody like me can do it, anybody could do it. But it's a hard thing to learn at first, to know, okay, what's my provider going to be? It does help that you have producers in a network, but when you were broached about the idea of continuing it, was it something that you were hesitant to embrace at first as a new medium, or did you just jump right on board?
You mean with sports reporters?
Yeah, as a podcast.
Yeah, we were kind of, we wish now, Mike, that we had started a sports reporters podcast when we were still on television, because I think it would have made the transition a lot easier, but we just didn't know enough about it, and we foolishly thought we were going to get to run forever on television. And then we tried to find a new television home. We did not. But all of a sudden we started with one company, and then Compass came along, and we were doing it once a week, and now we're doing it twice a week. And I think all in, Bob and Mitch and I probably done over 500 of these by now. And, Mitch was having some technical difficulties today. Bob and I did it alone this morning, and did a big baseball, did a half hour on baseball and preseason football, and Federer having another knee surgery. And we go for 45 or 50 minutes, and I swear it feels like 10 every single time.
Yeah, it just flies right by. I really do enjoy the conversation. Sometimes we'll have guests in there too. Robert Wool is a good guy that I love listening to, creator of Arliss. I mean, he's really interesting anytime you have him on. So, now that brings us into the concluding segment of this podcast, and it's going to end not the way it normally does, and you'll see why for the listeners in a moment. So this is called Rapid Fire. It consists of 5 hit and run questions from me, 5 answers from you. Although the fourth, there's technically 4, because the 5th one's interesting. So basically, well, are you ready?
Sure.
All this talking by me, just get to the point, Mike. Anyway, first, you mentioned Michael Jordan's your favorite athlete to have covered ever, and I don't blame you, but besides him, favorite athlete of any sport that you've had the honor to cover?
Arthur Ashe. Arthur Ashe made me think of a line that Jimmy Cannon once used about Joe Louis. Arthur Ashe was a credit to his race, the human race, and it was an honor to know him. Played golf with him about 6 months before he died. So sorry, never got to live long enough to see Obama.
Second, you've been to a lot of great games of a lot of different sports. Greatest game you've ever seen live?
Oh, it's not close. It's I tell people all the time, it's not just my favorite event, it's my favorite top 5 events. I was in Lake Placid in 1980, the night we beat the Soviets, and knew that night it was going to be the greatest sports event I've ever gotten to cover. I've covered many since, but nothing, because of the confluence of the world and those kids, and Aruzione's still a friend of mine. That was a night. If I could just have one night in sports that I could go back and experience all over again, it would be that February night, 1980.
Third, greatest game you wish you could have seen live.
Ooh, let me think. The greatest game I wish I could have seen live. I guess. That's a good one. I never thought about that. Wait, you've stumped me. Let me just think about this for 1 second. I saw Joe Carter's home run in person. I saw the ball roll between Buckner's legs. I guess if I had to pick one game, it might have been the night that Michael played that game in the finals against Utah when he was supposed to be too sick. And
Game 5.
Yeah.
1997.
Yeah. I'm sure there's other ones. I just can't think of one off the top of my head.
No, that's a good one. The flu game, 38 points in that game on what we later learned was food poisoning from a bad pizza, according to The Last Dance.
According to The Last Dance, that's what happened.
Fourth, who was funnier, Jimmy Breslin or Pete Hamill?
Oh, Pete. Okay, here's the thing. Pete was funnier in person, and we talked about this for years. And the reason we loved Jimmy as much as we did, Jimmy was funny without trying to be funny, and never, I think, appreciated how much sheer entertainment he provided for the rest of us simply by being Jimmy Breslin.
There you go. So fifth and finally, as somebody that grew up watching the sports reporters, I always wanted to do this. I didn't do this when Bob was on, and I kicked myself, so I want to get it right now. Do you have a parting shot ready? Just there you go. Because for those of you that grew up watching the sports reporters, at the end of every show, and they still do this in the podcast version, they end it with parting shots, which was just their thoughts.
I got to read this. I can't prop it up, but I'll try to read it, okay?
No problem. Mike will lead us off.
There you go. This isn't a parting shot as much as a parting thought. It was last Thursday night in Iowa that Garrett Cole was interviewed during the Field of Dreams game and joked about the, quote, Yankee variant of COVID and how it's affected the Yankees recently. Then over the weekend, Cole said something about how he couldn't understand why this was happening to him and his teammates. Well, I can. It starts with not enough of them clearly being vaccinated. This isn't about HIPAA protections or privacy laws or anything else. That doesn't come into play here. Let's stop talking about what percentage of Major League personnel has been vaccinated. Let's find out who's been vaccinated and who hasn't as a way of eliminating the guesswork. Everybody's a bear for analytics in baseball. Let's have some analytics for COVID.
I know I may run the risk of sounding like an entitled Yankee fan who thought the world began the moment Mark Lemke's pop-up settled into the glove of Charlie Hayes in October of 1996, but rest assured I'm not. Still, it goes without saying, it's been a minute, and not a New York minute, since the Yankees have been to, let alone won, a World Series. Not since the first year of the Obama administration after the Bronx Bombers celebrated a title, and that was back in 2009. And there's many factors as to why. Players on either side of the ball not delivering in the clutch, chief among them perhaps the biggest reason, however, I would say, is New York Yankees general manager Brian Cashman. GM of the Yankees since 1998, Cashman inherited tremendously built teams, courtesy of the late Gene Michael and Bob Watson. The only championship I believe he can truly claim as his own is the 2009 group that knocked off the defending champion Philadelphia Phillies in 6 games. Yes, he's elite at finding overlooked and undervalued talent. DJ LeMahieu and Gio Urshela certainly come to mind, but the one Achilles heel he refuses to address and is constantly undone by come playoff time is pitching. More specifically, starting pitching. Not since 2003, when names like Pettit, Wells, Clemens, and Messina took the rubber every 5 days, have the Yankees boasted a championship-worthy rotation, a problem that even now, with the addition of an ace like Garrett Cole, has yet to truly be solved. There are some within the Yankee fan base who suggest that manager Aaron Boone, a man who they believe, had he not sent Tim Wakefield's knuckleball into the New York Knight in Game 7 of the ALCS in 2003, probably wouldn't have his current job, be let go upon the conclusion of the season should the Yankees fail to make the playoffs and once again win it all. But while Boone certainly deserves some of the blame, even as the Yankees begin to play better, he's but a symptom of the problem. As the Yankees hurtle towards the end of this season, should it not result in a World Series championship or at least a playoff berth, that true problem must be rooted out. That true problem, the ultimate cause of the problem, not a symptom, being Brian Cashman. I hope that was good.
Good one.
Thank you.
Good one. You're very much in line. I like Brian, but I was going to use a line the other day and I just didn't want to get into it. But I said, I've cracked the code on Yankee coverage. When things go wrong, it's Aaron Boone's fault. When things go right, it's Brian Cashman's who gets the credit. And I keep thinking to myself, I did a parting shot on this today. Apparently, these guys think that team that had to be revamped at the trade deadline assembled itself, Mike. This has been really fun. You are a talented young man. I'm glad we finally got to do this, and we'll do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Before we go, however, if the people want to find you on social media, where can they find you?
At Mike Lupica on Twitter. That's it. I got nothing else. It's like an extended version of shooting from the lip. As my son Alex said, Dad, Twitter was shooting from the lip was Twitter before there was Twitter.
Yep, absolutely. I agree with that. On my end, for the listeners out there, if you're listening for the first time, you don't know where to find me. Twitter, Mike in New Haven, which is my old WFA and call-in name from years ago. On Instagram, I'm original_MC1. On LinkedIn, Mike Colón. Type in Mike Colón, MIC_D for the podcast, and you'll find me. If you want to ring me up on any sports-related inquiries for the podcast, the business line for that is 917-727-0891. And of course, you can email me, Colón on sports, COLON on sports @gmail.com. You got any other inquiries, send them over to my email for that. The Colón report, THECOLON report @gmail.com, or call me up 917-781-6189. YouTube MC's audio, MC_S audio for the video version of the podcast. And you can find us everywhere else that you get your podcast audio platforms. Coming up on the Mike Lupica podcast. He retired from the NYPD in 2006, and instead of transitioning to a quieter stage of life, he embarked on a counterterrorism mission in Iraq and recently wrote a book about it. Retired NYPD Sergeant Christopher Strong will join the show Tuesday for an interesting deep dive into his life. On August 23rd, a continuation of the miniseries Tales from the Boom Room profiles of the NYPD's bomb squad with retired NYPD bomb squad detective first grade Kevin Barry, who will discuss, amongst many things, defusing a suicide bomb that was still strapped to a live bomber in 1990 with just a coat on. He didn't have any of the regular bomb squad gear they wear, and he did that under some terrifying circumstances, but got the job done. Investigations into major incidents like the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, the crash of TWA Flight 800, and responding to the World Trade Center on 9/11, and the chilling last words a colleague uttered to him shortly before they parted ways, never seeing that colleague alive again. Coming up on the Mike Lupica podcast, some very exciting shows. So in the meantime, on behalf of Mike Lupica, I've enjoyed this immensely. I'm Mike Colón, and we will see you next time. Take care, everyone.